Good evening. Welcome. My name is Daniel Schwartz. I'd like to welcome you all here to the Rudman Center, to the University of New Hampshire School of Law. We've got a wonderful panel for you tonight on the death penalty. The timing of it, I don't think, could really be any more appropriate than it is. It's a controversial topic that I know we all have our own personal opinions on, which is why we've given you these note cards. If you have any questions, feel free to write them down, and either Lindsay or Alexandra will be up and down the aisles to collect them from you. This is going to be our last event here this year for the Rudman Center, so welcome. We hope you enjoy it. If this is your first time here, thank you for coming, and if this isn't, well, welcome back. Our panelists tonight, to my left, Representative Cushing. To his left, Attorney Douglas, former Justice Douglas. To his left, Attorney Valinsky, representing the only person in the state of New Hampshire currently on death row. And to his left, State Senator D'Alessandro. Our panel will be moderated by Professor John Greabe, constitutional law scholar. So we'll kick things off. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please remember to use your note cards. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dan. I'd like to echo Dan welcome. It's fantastic to see such a nice turnout on a Wednesday afternoon. This is an issue, of course, that always arouses a great deal of interest. I was just listening, some of you may have heard actually the Diane Rehm show this morning, talked about the death penalty and used as its point of departure the Tsarnaev case, as to which some verdicts were returned this afternoon, unsurprisingly guilty verdicts. And the case will now transition into the phase where the question will become whether to impose the death penalty on Mr. Tsarnaev. The format for tonight is as Dan outlined it. So if you have questions, you can indicate to Alexandra and Lindsay again. If you have questions for particular panelists, note that at the top of the card. Or if you want to ask a general question, I will relay it along. Because sometimes questions tend to be quite long, I may try to concisely summarize the point that I understand you to be asking. And so what we'd like to do to start, though, is to invite each of our panelists to speak for 8 to 10 minutes or so in response to the question that brought us together tonight, which is the death penalty on death row? And I anticipate that we will be talking about that question or answering that question, both with a look at national events, but also with a look at local events, because of course we do currently have a person on death row in the state, and we're awaiting a final determination from the state Supreme Court. So we may well be moving into some constitutional issues with respect to that as well. Compelling because New Hampshire hasn't executed anybody since 1939, so it's been quite a while. Tonight we're going to just start out with some perspectives from our distinguished panelists who see the issue, at least in some ways, a bit differently from one another. Speaking first will be Attorney Charles Douglas. Speaking second will be Representative Renny Cushing. Speaking third will be Senator Lou D'Alessandro. And speaking fourth will be Attorney Andrew Valinsky. And without further ado, I'll turn it over and ask, is the death penalty on death row?
Thank you, John, and thank you, fellow panelists. I know this is a topic that probably there are no more than 3 people in the room who are undecided about. I'm currently reading Lincoln and the Press, which is about his battles with the media in 1860 and 1861. And if you had a debate on slavery in the U.S. House in 1861, I doubt that one single member was open to be changed in terms of their vote. So I come to you knowing that folks either favor or support or oppose the death penalty. I just think I want to approach it a little bit from the New Hampshire perspective, because we have a very limited statute that is not as sweeping as some of them around the country. About 35 states have the ultimate price for murderous activity. In August of 1997, a man named Carl in Colebrook, New Hampshire, was approached by a state trooper while he was at an IGA parking lot. The trooper never finished engaging with Carl because Carl shot and killed him immediately, and then shot and killed the next trooper who arrived at the parking lot. He then stole a state police car and went to downtown Colebrook to the office of the local district judge who had ruled against him in some cases, and he shot and killed her as she tried to flee her office. And then he went and killed the man who tried to help her, who was the editor of the Colebrook News Sentinel. Carl Greabe later that afternoon shot 4 other law enforcement officers, only wounding them, before he was shot and killed by a law enforcement officer. Had he not been killed, he would have had at least 3 capital murder charges under our statute, because it includes law enforcement officers and judicial officers, as well as prison guards in the performance of their duty. Greabe, in my opinion, would have very much deserved the imposition of the death penalty. He would be a classic case for having done things so outside the pale, so beyond civilized society, that that society has the power to impose the ultimate punishment. They can only do it, though, under the state and the federal constitutions. Your life can be taken from you if you have been provided due process of law. And I'm sure Greabe would have had a trial, and he would have been defended, I'm sure, by able counsel. And in the end, I don't think a New Hampshire jury would have acquitted him or would have failed, if qualified to sit, would have failed to impose the ultimate penalty. We can debate whether state-sanctioned taking of life under those circumstances is moral or not, and I can't argue with anyone's morality. We all have our moral positions, and I wouldn't begin to say that it's immoral to take this position or not. But in terms of a society imposing a punishment for the kinds of crimes that the Carl Greabes of the world unfortunately occasionally commit, is, I think, proper for New Hampshire. Now, 15 years ago, this same debate was being held in the New Hampshire legislature. In the year 2000, the legislature actually repealed the death penalty. And when it came to Governor Shaheen's desk, she vetoed it. And I'll just quote a few things because they reflect her concerns that, frankly, I would mirror. First, the advent of DNA testing reduces the likelihood that innocent people will be convicted and sentenced to death. New Hampshire has an excellent public defender program, and our criminal defense bar, folks such as Andy Valensky and others in this room, I am seeing several here who I've known over the years. She pointed out we have some excellent criminal defense attorneys, and they are highly likely to be involved in this type of a case. We have to have a unanimous jury of 12 find beyond a reasonable doubt every element of the charged offense, and then there must be a unanimous finding beyond a reasonable doubt that at least two aggravating factors exist and that they outweigh any mitigating factors. Now, I'm paraphrasing and in part quoting from then Governor Shaheen. What she didn't really mention, but I wanted to again mention, and I'm almost concluding, is the issue of the narrowness of our statutes. We do not have what's called felony murder, which many states have. Anytime you're committing a felony, it can be of any nature, and a death involved, you can be subject to capital punishment. What about deterrence? The amazing thing is some of the best evidence is the people on death row. They will fight for years, 15, 20 years, to avoid the death penalty that they have been convicted and sentenced to be imposed. They don't want to die. And you can't prove how many police or how many prison guards' lives have not been taken because the murderer changed his or her mind at the last minute, maybe used force, but not deadly or excessive force. Sure, those who killed like Greabe were not deterred. No one is going to guarantee that the penalty will always deter every single person intent on murder. But to say that it would never deter and has never deterred, I think doesn't make any common sense, because people would much prefer to live than to die. And it's the old saw, everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die. When it comes to the death penalty, I think it's self-evident and is a factor in making decisions that we can never, you can't poll people and say, today, did you not kill someone because New Hampshire has the death penalty, yes or no? Andy Smith is not going to be able to do that kind of a poll down at UNH. But I think your common sense tells you that if it deters one person once a year from taking the life of a Judge Bunnell or a trooper, then it is worth having. And if it's worth having, it has some deterrent effect. I know you're going to hear a very different view from Representative Cushing, and I've known him for years. He's a sincere and devoted advocate in the opposite direction. I'll turn it over to you, Renny.
Thank you. New Hampshire's not in love with the death penalty. In the 4 centuries as a state and as a colony, we've executed a grand total of 22 people. The last person was put to death in 1939. And since 1834, at least, when Governor Badger first asked the legislature to abolish the death penalty, whether or not we should have policies that allow the state to kill people has been a matter of public debate. I think there's some historical reasons why we don't like the death penalty. The fact that the last woman executed, Ruth Belay, was what we now recognize as being wrongfully convicted, I think still resonates with the state, with people in this state. But I think it has to do with a lot about our values, and that's what I want to talk about. Part of the New Hampshire value is a skepticism of government. We, generally speaking, don't trust the government to collect taxes or plow snow. And so the idea that we would give the power to the government to kill people sometimes really doesn't set easy with people. I speak about the death penalty. I can talk about the mechanics of why it's a bad idea, but I look at the death penalty through the lens of somebody who's been the survivor of a homicide victim. My father was shotgunned to death in front of my mother in our family home in Hampton 27 years ago. And 4 years ago, my brother-in-law Stephen was murdered in a similar crime. And it's through the lens of a victim survivor that I come to oppose the death penalty. And I know that may catch people by surprise, because certainly in our society there's kind of a paradigm out there that presumes that everybody's had somebody murdered would like to see the person responsible put to death, and they need that in order to get better, in order to find closure somewhere. And as a consequence, our elected officials are under almost a moral obligation to provide for an execution solution to victims' pain. You know that. That's very prevalent during, it's popular in our culture. But I'm somebody who, though I've had somebody murdered, I don't fit that paradigm, and it doesn't mean that I'm not, sometimes I'm not a psycho, I'm not a saint. It's not that I didn't love my father or my brother-in-law. It's just that, like many people who've had the unspeakable happen to them, we've muddled along and come to conclude that really a ritual killing by public employees is not going to do anything to bring our loved ones back. And that's it. That's the one thing that the death penalty can't do, is the one thing that people really want, and that's to bring your loved ones back. But I want to tell you, there's nothing prepared me to be the survivor homicide victim. And I usually speak about victims before I go to the death penalty, because that's really important. I know that's why we're having a conversation about the death penalty, because people get killed in our society. But something happened to me. Right after my father was murdered, I was in the dead zone. I didn't know exactly how. I was trying to figure out how to get up in the morning and what to do with the empty chair at the kitchen table, and how to get back to empty. But something happened a couple weeks after my father's killers were arrested that really made me think about the death penalty, because a family friend of mine came up to me in the corner grocery store and said, "Hey, Renny, I hope they fry the bastards. I hope they fry the bastards so you and your mother and family can get some peace." And I didn't know what to say, because this man, Vicky, he'd known me my whole life. And for different reasons, before my father had been murdered, I'd opposed the death penalty. And he knew that. And yet here he was coming to me and saying, "I hope there was an execution." In a way, I realized he had good intentions. He was trying to give me, I think he was trying to give me comfort. I didn't know how to respond, and I couldn't respond. I was numbed about it. But afterwards, I thought about it, and I realized he'd presumed that because my father had been murdered, I would change my position about capital punishment. And as I thought about that, I realized that if that happened, if I changed my position on the death penalty because my father was murdered, well, that would only give over more power to the murderer. It would only really compound the crime, because not only would my father be taken from me, but so too would my values. And I think it's the same for a society as it is for individual. If we let those who kill turn us into killers, then evil triumphs, and we're all worse off. But because I live in this society where, everybody presumes people like me would want the death penalty, it was like I had to slap myself the side of the head. I'm going, what a pain. This is something else that I have to do because I had somebody murdered. Because silence is consent, I almost had an affirmative obligation to speak out and say, I don't believe in the death penalty, lest my silence be construed as thinking that everybody like me wanted to have. Anyway, so that's, in a way, because homicides, murder is about power, and it's about taking power away from somebody. In a way, for me, standing here and talking about homicide is a way that I claim power and take power back from the murderers. And stand here and speaking in opposition to the death penalty is a way that I actually get to speak as a victim survivor on behalf, from a victim's perspective, in opposition to the death penalty. And I know that my friend Lizzie, that there's others here who also, have had a similar journey. And just telling you that from a victim survivor perspective, what I dislike about the death penalty is that it's a distraction. It takes our view, a focus away from the real needs of victims, which is something that we do all the time. We tend to focus, we make rock stars out of killers, which I can't stomach. We spend an inordinate amount of resources on one small group of homicides, and we say that this is the worst of the worst. I will tell you that for every person who's had a murder in their family, the worst of the worst murder is the one of their own loved one. And yet, sometimes we pick and choose, or we make value judgments about whose lives are really important. So we'll devote millions of dollars to one case in the state of New Hampshire and open up the fiscal committee and open up the treasury to pursue one case to put someone to death. At the same time, there's 120 unsolved homicides in the state, for which up until 3 years ago, the state spent 0 general fund dollars. So there's a lot of reasons why I oppose the death penalty. I'm going to be respectful of the time and just say thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. I see out in the audience 2 former attorney generals, and it's always nice to see them here. Phil McLaughlin, graduate of the College of the Holy Cross. Welcome, Phil. Wonderful to see you. You know, I first started thinking about the death penalty when I was a freshman at the University of New Hampshire, and I had a freshman sociology course, and my teacher was Stuart Palmer, Dr. Stuart Palmer. Dr. Stuart Palmer wrote a book, Frustration Leads to Aggression, Leads to Murder. And we spent a lot of time talking about murder. One of the readings of that class was a book by Carol Chessman, Catch Me Before I Kill More was the title of the book. Lo and behold, in 1973, I got elected to the legislature. I'm a member of the House of Representatives. And a bill that I have to vote on is the death penalty. And the death penalty in New Hampshire is a very, very narrow death penalty. Very, very narrow death penalty. As Renny says, hasn't been used since 1939. We have only had 1 black executed in the state of New Hampshire since its inception. And we have 1 person on death row as we speak, being represented by one of the distinguished members of this panel. So in that freshman sociology course, we started talking about the death penalty, what the death penalty meant. And I thought, gee, the death penalty has tremendous meaning, the death penalty. I mean, it's over, and when it's over, it's over. And why do I support it? And I support it for a couple of reasons. The most noteworthy is something that happened in the district that I represent in Manchester, New Hampshire. Young police officer, Officer Briggs, was killed in my district. Now, the amazing thing of it is I had his mother in class. So I had his mother in class. I knew Briggs. Wonderful, wonderful guy. Made a difference in the lives of a lot of people. Good police officer. Did good police work. His life was ended, obviously, and nothing can make up for that. Then I thought about my upbringing. I'm an Italian-American kid. I grew up in East Boston, Massachusetts. And when I was just a child, someone was smoking on the first floor of my home. It was a 3-decker house. So the house burns down, and I'm rescued by a firefighter. Firefighter comes into my house, risks his life to save me, to save my brothers, my mother, my father, and my aunts and uncles who lived with us. In those days, families lived together in tenement housing in the greater Boston area. So when I was debating the death penalty, I said, this guy risked his life to save my life. What if someone took his life? What's the story? Why? There should be a punishment for that. And I realize times have changed. We now have DNA. We have a more exhaustive process that we go through. So hopefully, you get to the person who's really committed the crime. As I said, it's a very, 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 very narrow death penalty in New Hampshire. But I see Mrs. Briggs. I see the wife. I see the kids. And there's something missing in their life that can never be replaced. Never be replaced. There is nothing that can bring that family back together. So I say, the death penalty. You don't want to abuse it, but indeed use it. When I was in the Marine Corps, they taught me how to kill people. It was very simple. If I was going to go to war, I was going to kill people. Well, either that or they were going to kill me. Happens every day. So think about that. Think about the society. Think about this particular situation. Is there a better way? You know, one would hope so. But at this time, you know, I don't see a better way. We're all watching a couple of trials as we speak. We're watching the trial in Boston, and we're watching the trial of the professional football player. That young kid in Boston ruined the lives of a lot of people. A lot of people. That little child that was killed, can't ever replace that kid. Never replace that kid. The daughter whose leg was blown off. I mean, when you see people who are maimed and whose lives are changed dramatically by this incident, it makes you think. And we don't abuse it in New Hampshire. We haven't used it since 1939. It is an expensive situation. I agree with Representative Cushing. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money that could be spent on many other things. But the law says you got to have an appeal, you got to go through a process, and we do that. I also agree there are over 100 unsolved homicides in the state of New Hampshire as we speak. I think of that young girl up in Stewartstown. That's never been solved. What an aching heart the people must have over that particular situation. So it's something you have to think about. But I say this to you. When I'm downtown and Mrs. Briggs comes up to me, she points to my little pin, 83. That's Briggs's badge number. And she smiles at me and she says, "You haven't forgotten." That's one of the reasons why I support the death penalty. I don't like anything to be misused or abused, but I think there are certain situations where the death penalty applies. So thank you very much. Been an honor to speak to you. I'm sure we'll have better conversation, but thank you.
Good evening. Thanks to UNH Law for holding this discussion. It's a very important topic, and I'm glad to help participate. My day job is as a regular lawyer in a regular law firm in Manchester. But since I graduated from law school in 1980, I've worked on death penalty cases at different stages. So I tried 3 death penalty cases in Tennessee. I've worked on direct appeals from death penalty sentences in Tennessee and extensively in Georgia. I've written habeas petitions in Georgia and Mississippi. One of the Georgia clients I've represented for 25 years in various stages in the state of Georgia. I also argued a death penalty case before the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Greabe versus Mississippi. I argued it in 1986, and it was decided in '87. And there are two stories from the Greabe versus Mississippi argument that I would hope to share with you. I got involved in Greabe versus Mississippi. I was recruited by an old law professor named Steve Bright, who at the time ran both a prisoners' rights and a death penalty resource center in Atlanta. He was looking for a lawyer who would review the record in this case from Mississippi and file a petition for cert, which is how you ask the Supreme Court to take your case, in the hopes of buying 6 or 8 months so that he could locate a lawyer who had the ability to go down to Mississippi and do the post-conviction work on the case. So Steve called and asked if I would do that. We lived here in New Hampshire. I filed a cert petition, and lightning struck. The Supreme Court accepted the case, and we were off to the United States Supreme Court. I wrote the brief. I moot courted it with the NAACP Inc. Fund in New York, which was quite a humbling experience. And then we showed up in DC. My wife, Amy, and I went down to argue the case. The lawyer on the other side was an assistant attorney general named Marvin White, who was a decent fellow, dealt with me fairly. And we made arrangements to meet in the clerk's office, because we'd never met face-to-face. And the clerk's office at the U.S. Supreme Court is carpeted with a plush oriental rug, and it has this wood molding on the walls. And we met and introduced ourselves, and Marvin had his boss with him, the Attorney General for the state of Mississippi. That's an elected position, unlike our attorneys general who are appointed by the governor. And this Attorney General was kind of a rotund, political type of guy. And Marvin introduced me to his boss, and we shook hands. And then I introduced the Attorney General to my wife, who was with me. And the Attorney General reached out his hand and said, "How are you, little lady?" My wife was wearing her lawyer suit. She was a Georgetown grad. I think she started working on her LLM at that point in time. And just as he said, "little lady," she started to squeeze and wouldn't let go. And this political AG's face just got redder and redder as my petite wife hurt him by squeezing his hand. And I finally said, "Come on, Amy, I need to go prep some more." And she let go of this poor guy. So I prepped. I had an afternoon argument. You have to sign in the morning. I prepped in the library in the stacks, did my argument. It went fine. And then 6 months later, we got a decision from the Supreme Court. And the death sentence was reversed based on our hard work. The vote was 4-1 to 4. So there was a plurality decision written by Justice Blackmun in our favor. 4 dissenters voted against our position, and the deciding vote was Justice Powell, who wrote a short concurrence agreeing with the reversal of the death penalty. This was in 1987. 6 months later, Justice Powell retired and was replaced by Justice Kennedy, who I have no doubt would have voted against us. And so, but for the luck of time, my client would be dead now. And so that arbitrary factor, when that case happened to hit the Supreme Court and who happened to be sitting and not yet retired, made all the difference between life and death for David Gray. That's an innocent arbitrary factor. That's not like denying the defense resources necessary to properly try a case, denying expense money for investigators, using failed scientific tests like neutron activation analysis, which was the vogue for 10 or 15 years and has turned out to be completely junk science. It's nothing like racial bias. Think about standing up in a courtroom representing the most hated person in the community based on the conduct that is probably not much at issue. And whether bias because the person's different from you, because maybe they're from the wrong side of town, they're from a different race, they talk differently, they act differently, and whether that plays any role in the decision as to whether someone should live or die, that is the problem with the death penalty. And as much as I love my adopted home state of New Hampshire, we are not free from those external factors. As good as the public defender program is here in New Hampshire, one of the cases they tried for Mr. Addison, they sought a continuance because the lawyers were burnt out going trial to trial to trial. Addison is actually 4 cases. The judge gave them a 3-day continuance. That's an arbitrary factor. The same judge, Judge McGuire, sat on all of Addison's cases even though they were in different courthouses. That's an arbitrary factor. Every day, the lawyers, and I suspect some of the jurors, saw the phalanx of police officers supporting their fallen fellow officer outside the courthouse. That's an arbitrary factor. The person who made the decision to seek the death penalty against Michael Addison is our U.S. Senator, Senator Ayotte. Unlike the federal system, where there is a prescribed process by which capital charging decisions are made, it's a discretionary decision to our Attorney General. Is that an arbitrary factor? I think we do a lot of things well here in New Hampshire. But to think that we are above and better than all of this arbitrariness that happens in these cases where the decision ultimately is irrevocable is hard to accept. And so for that reason, I think we need to think long and hard before we execute the only person on death row who happens to be a black guy from Roxbury, who I represent on one of his felony habeas petitions. I actually don't represent on the underlying capital charge. So trust me, with all respect to Officer Briggs, who was only doing his job, the answer doesn't lie with executing Mr. Addison. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. And again, I'd remind you, if you have questions, please pass them along. I only have one at this point. I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative with the first question. Oh, good, excellent. And pick up on something that Attorney Volinsky just mentioned. You know, the nation since last summer has been embroiled once again with the question of how our criminal justice system deals with race and whether the criminal justice system deals fairly with race. It is an undeniably uncomfortable optical fact that the one person on death row in New Hampshire is African American in a largely white state, and that as horrible, undeniably horrible the crime was of which he stands convicted, there have been other horrible crimes that have not resulted in death penalties. And I guess I'd like to, and anyone who would like to, I'd like to address that. How, you know, no one here, I don't see anyone here with a conflict of interest necessarily in the case. You know, if Attorney Volinsky, if that's just something you can't address, I totally understand. But can you talk a little bit about the fact that that Addison is African American, and that is troubling to a lot of people in the state? You go ahead, sure, anyone.
Sure. I guess I try to consider the Addison case in context. At the same time as Addison was being prosecuted for capital murder, there was another capital murder case involving John Brooks. John Brooks premeditatedly hired someone to beat someone to death. So there's no question about premeditation, and paid him for it. Brooks went to trial, was found guilty, and was sentenced to life by a jury. In Mr. Addison's case, the jury was asked specifically to find if Mr. Addison premeditated the shooting of Officer Brooks, and the jury refused to find that. The jury was also asked to find if Addison would be a danger in prison, and the jury refused to find that as well. So I can't say that the jurors were racially biased, but it's clear that the white businessman was a lot more like the jurors we see in New Hampshire than the young guy from Roxbury, who looks the part. And so whether it's pure racial bias or the bias of a different person from yourself, I'm not convinced that it played no role here. There are studies that have been done nationally and reviewed in the McCleskey case that establish that race is a factor, both as to the victim's race and the defendant's race. And those are very concerning things to place on kind of a rickety justice system where people operate in my name as the state, and I prefer that not to happen.
Anyone else?
Yeah. Lou, Senator D'Alessandro mentioned that, there's been one African American out of the 22 people who've been executed in the state of New Hampshire, which is true. But there's also only been one person who's been executed for a crime other than murder, and that was the African American. He was given the death penalty for rape. And that just stands out as a kind of an interesting historical footnote.
That's true. Yeah, Rennie's correct. He did not commit a capital murder. It was for rape that he was hanged. I wasn't around in the 1700s, though many people have accused me of that.
Are you sure?
Well, I was a mere pup in those days. Off the subject of the death penalty, but let me tell you something about racial bias, because I think it plays a role in our society. When I was in the Marine Corps, I had a drill instructor who was a black man, Sergeant McClellan. When I left the base, I could go and drink at a bar and I could eat at a restaurant. He could do neither. What made him any different than me? He was my commander when we were inside, and he was on the outside. We were on the outside, and I must say, and I'm talking about racial prejudice because I think that's a very significant situation. Washington, D.C., the capital of our country, was a segregated city. It was a segregated city. So it's not only racial bias, like black versus white, but I mean, we've witnessed ethnic bias in this country over and over again, and I think every one of the immigrant waves can tell you about that. The Irish who came in Manchester when on the door of the factory, no Irish need apply, the Italos, and I can quote the death penalty case for Sacco and Vanzetti, when the Governor Fuller, said he just couldn't commute their sentences because they were Italian Americans and they were socialists. So I think that's a hurdle this country's got to get over, and it does exist. I admit that. I would be pretty ignorant if I didn't admit it. But in every case, you try to get the best representation, and in Brooks's case, he could afford it. I mean, I know a little bit about that case. I'm not a lawyer, but I know a little bit about that case. So I think that's something that does exist and something that we have to get over as a society. I mean, how many African Americans are in the audience? I don't see one.
All right, this is a question, and there's really terrific questions here. This is a question to Representative Cushing and to Attorney Volinsky. Even if the two of you oppose capital punishment on moral grounds, would you at least agree that capital punishment is constitutional, at least in the abstract, recognizing that it can be unconstitutionally applied if, for example, applied in a racially discriminatory manner? But I mean, clearly the U.S. Constitution and the New Hampshire Constitution were drafted and became law at a time when everybody understood capital punishment to be constitutional. So should we at least take that issue off the table and debate the death penalty purely in terms of policy?
You first.
I have no problem debating it either policy or constitutional. I mean, I oppose it because for moral grounds. But I'm from New Hampshire, and when I read my Constitution, my state Constitution, it tells me that the true purpose, the true design of punishment is the rehabilitation, not the extermination of mankind. I might be a literalist on that, but that tells me that you shouldn't be exterminating people, that we shouldn't be practicing the death penalty, even acknowledging at the time that the Constitution was framed that the death penalty did exist. But I think this whole notion of evolving standards of decency, whatever that is, I think that we've evolved to the point where it's just plain indecent. And it's really pretty unusual and pretty cruel, our death penalty here in New Hampshire. If we haven't killed somebody for 75 years and all we want to do is like set one guy up to strap him down and pump him full of poison and put him down.
I think the only thing I would add, Rennie referred to the evolving standard of decency. That's the Eighth Amendment standard as articulated in the Weems case. In the mid-'80s, if you were a juvenile, you could be put to death. By the mid-'90s, that was no longer the case. In the early 90s, if you were of a certain IQ or less, you could be put to death. And by the early 2000s, that was no longer the case. So there is an evolving standard. I feel bad for the guy who was a juvenile before the law changed, or who was developmentally impaired before the law changed. I think the Constitution doesn't provide, in this day and age, for the death penalty, because I think there should be recognition that due process isn't a sufficient protection as these cases are done.
I would disagree. I think, at least facially, it is clear under the Fifth Amendment and under Part 1, Article 15 of our Bill of Rights in New Hampshire that you can be deprived of life, liberty, and property as long as it's in accordance with due process of law. The thing that I guess I wanted to mention in terms of race and due process that is more troubling to me is not the Addison type of procedure, which is highly thorough, well-lawyered, well-argued, is going to go on for years, but is state-sanctioned summary executions by one cop against one unarmed citizen that happens 4 or 5 times a year in this state. That state-sanctioned capital punishment involves no indictments, no trial, no lawyers, no judge, no jury. It just ends up that someone, like the woman in the car in Manchester, has 11 bullets shot into her head, unarmed and dead. And there is an official blessing from the state. Oh, well, the cop was justified. They're always justified. That state-sanctioned murder, in my opinion, is something the legislature needs to be more concerned about, because it happens much more regularly than the 1939 or the Addison case. It happens several times a year. And it should be handled by an outside, independent arm, not the group that works with these cops every day called the AG's office. And you may say, well, we've had Greg Smith, we've had Phil McLaughlin, they're great guys, we can trust them. All that may be true. But institutionally, it doesn't work for the public. It does not seem fair, and it does not seem to be the right people looking at what happened. Just as, you know, Ferguson involved the racial issue, which at least so far in the last couple of years hasn't been an issue in our police executions, but you know, there's provision for self-defense by the police, et cetera, et cetera. But there are instances where an unarmed, mentally ill person, such as in Albuquerque, where they've had 40 cases of police fatal shootings of unarmed people, and finally now they have a new police chief and they're going to have a new system. I just think our state is fixated on Addison and missing the 3 or 4 times a year when there is questionable justification. Maybe there is some, maybe it's perfect, but who should investigate that? And what about that family's right to some due process? And that's what I think we miss in the debate about the Chernyevs and the Addisons of the world.
Thank you. I'm going to consolidate themes because I've gotten so many cards and so many good questions. A number of the cards pick up on the theme that we're talking about tonight, which is a perception, at least among some, that the death penalty may be on its way out. Certainly, if we look around the world, we would have to acknowledge that the death penalty has become increasingly rare, and especially in countries with political systems like our own. I heard today on that Diane Rehm show that since the death penalty has been reinstituted in this country, there have only been 4 executions in New England. It was reinstituted in 1976. So passing that along, that's not my own knowledge, but that's what I heard today. 3 in Pennsylvania, 1 in Connecticut. So certainly the death penalty has become very, very rare in New England. And with that as background, this is a question that was directed at Senator D'Alessandro, but I think everybody will want to respond to. Is it, you had actually said that at this time in your remarks there's no better way, but other political entities have made a different judgment, and is it time to move on to something else in light of what much of the world seems to be concluding, and certainly our New England?
Well, I think there's always a time to look on. I mean, that's part of life. It's part of the experience. And I think we've done better as a society. I hope we can do better. It's a process. It's an ongoing process, and I think as more people are educated, and I think that's a real issue, particularly in parts of this country, education becomes a vital situation. When people are more knowledgeable, that's another aspect that has to be considered, and when they're represented. You know, I can think of many instances where representation didn't occur. So sure, I think it's an evolving process. Now, hopefully we solve things in an evolutionary manner rather than a revolutionary manner. And yes, I mean, I see things moving. I don't think there's any question about that. As I said, you know, in the legislature on a daily basis, you see things moving, and hopefully they're moving in the right direction. One of the concerns, or one of the problems with the death penalty is if you are involved, family, and something, that's the heart-wrenching part of it. That's the tough. I admire Renny for his stance, but I had a family member murdered. I could never forgive the people who murdered that person. I could never forgive them. And if I could find them, I think I would be so angry that I might try to do something about it. But I'm evolving. My wife is an anti-death penalty person. My kids are anti-death penalty person. So there's talk and pressure all the time to move. And I think I want to be a better person when I leave this earth than I was when I came. So I hope that evolutionary process will take place. But it's still extremely, extremely difficult. We're only human beings. You know, it's just extremely difficult. And that's how I see the issue.
I mean, I know that, Lou, that you've had a murder in your family, and I just don't think I don't want you to equate forgiveness with being opposed to the death penalty. I mean, I'm not a forgiver. I just don't. It's not, the death penalty. It's not about the person upon whom it's imposed. It's about me. It's about us. It's not about them. The problem is we make it about them. But the problem with our death penalty, it's a broken system. I mean, that's the reality. Even if in theory you think it's okay to do, it makes sense, it's constitutional, it just doesn't work in this country. I mean, there's been in the new era, there's been over 150 people who've been found guilty by a jury of their peers in due process and convicted, who subsequently have been found to be innocent and released from death row. Just last week, somebody who'd been on death row for 30 years was released. And it's kind of like a crapshoot. And if you take a look at the death penalty, it's not for the worst of the worst, it's for the people with the worst lawyers. We've got, 1 out of 9, for every 8 people we execute, we release 1 person from death row. I mean, if you're flying an airplane and 1 out of 10 planes crash, you probably wouldn't be boarding that. But that's the system that we have. And we can tinker with it and we can try with it, but the reality is the world is moving away from the death penalty. A minority of the countries in this world still practice the death penalty. And when we find our country in making the top 5 list of countries that execute, standing with with China, with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, I mean that's just not who we should be with. And it's kind of an embarrassment. And I understand people of goodwill. I think that there are moral arguments on both sides. I respect the morality of that. That's not the issue there. But it's broke. It just doesn't work. And you can tinker with it, or you can just move on. And we have other ways to be safe.
Some questions about deterrence, and we know that there are studies that point in both directions about whether or not the death penalty has a deterrent effect. I think at least my understanding is that we cannot conclusively say one way or the other whether or not the death penalty has a deterrent effect. And given that it may have a deterrent effect, even a slight deterrent effect, if you couple that with a state like ours, where I think it's very hard to imagine, given our history and tradition, a factually innocent person being convicted in this state, When you combine those two things, shouldn't we reserve the possibility, at least, of the ultimate sentence in our law, even if it's rarely applied, simply by virtue of the fact that it may actually cause one innocent life to be spared? That's for anybody.
You want to respond, Jack, first?
I happen to agree. I think that you can debate whether it is a deterrent, but we have folks usually every, I'm going to say every couple of years, in the prison you will find an inmate who is beaten to death or stabbed to death. But luckily, the guards who are unarmed and very often locked into a wing with 20 or 30 or 40 people, all of whom are convicted felons, and they have nothing on them, not a knife, not a nightstick, not a gun. Most of the guards that at least I've visited with, and there are some who disagree, feel that it is a deterrent because they're protected when they're with people who've got life without parole. If you've got someone who is in prison, life without parole, tell me what the downside is to 2 lives without parole, or 3, or 4. There really isn't any. If you're going to die there, you're going to die there. But they don't seem to want to do that. They want to live. And that's because they don't want to be put to death and executed. And so I think you put that kind of argument on the table. I can't go in with Andy Smith and interview 20 guys who are on their life without parole, but I'll bet you at least some of the guards would feel that if you took that away and there was no ultimate penalty, they would feel less safe in their unarmed lock-in with these folks than they would be with the law as it is. And I think the problem that Renny talks about, and Andy, around the country, is in states where the death penalty is covers many more crimes, frankly, than it does in New Hampshire. Ours is a very limited group of people who are protected, and I think that's one difference in why you're not likely to get a factually innocent person in New Hampshire. You may get the issue of aggravation, premeditation, mental state, but the odds of someone like a Carl Greabe being falsely, had he lived, being falsely accused of killing 4 people and wounding 4 others, I don't see it in our system. In our system here. Does that mean it's perfect everywhere else? No. Is it perfect here? No. But I just think I wouldn't want to give up that deterrent effect.
Okay, just a quick follow-up, because it just came. Do prison inmates know that the statute protects, in particular, prison guards? Is that information?
They know a lot about the criminal law, far more than you would think.
Right.
There are always lawyers in prison, which is reassuring to many of you who are not lawyers. There are all kinds of folks who are transferred in and out of there. There's some well-educated people in that institution, and they know that it is the death penalty if they were to kill a guard.
I quite frankly don't even know where to start. So let's start here. We have a criminal justice system based on a burden of proof, which is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's our highest, hardest burden of proof. Why? Because we as a society don't value the mistakes that can be made in the criminal justice system. So now we have an argument to justify the death penalty, which under the best circumstances we conclude that the evidence is meh. We don't know if it's a deterrent or it's not a deterrent. Based on that meh evaluation of the efficacy of the death penalty, we're going to use it in our name to punish someone because it might be a deterrence to someone who was probably drugged out, drunk, stupid on the night of the killing. How is that consistent with the values that we aspire to as a civilized society? Number one. Number two, the distinction about killing an innocent person is not the question. Death penalty cases are often about killers where there is no doubt that they committed the crime. The question is, do we punish them by allowing them to live their lives in prison or be put to death? And that is a balance that we ask jurors to do who have no experience. They come uneducated, uninformed, with whatever biases they walked in the door. And so whether or not our wonderful judicial system in New Hampshire and our strong public defender service would prevent an innocent man from being put to death isn't the question. The question is, are there arbitrary factors that affect that life and death balancing that has to happen? And until we can say whether we as New Hampshireites are so different from every other state in the nation, and by the way, Pennsylvania is not New England.
That was listed in the show as New England. I went with it. So then what?
New York isn't either.
It's a bias that we don't expect that we call the state New England when it's not.
No, that's,
I'm
thank
kidding.
you. Yeah, I think
But-
it was Northeast, to be fair, and I
There you go.
misspoke there.
That's all right, I'll accept that. But, so there are real problems with analyzing this in the wrong way. It's not mistake as to actual innocence. It's whether this delicate balancing can occur absent external arbitrary biasing factors. And I don't think it can.
You know, if the death penalty was a deterrent, Houston, Texas would be the safest city in America. That county sends more people to death row than any other jurisdiction. But as we're talking about death, I can't help but look up and see Phil McLaughlin and Barbara Cushing and this issue about whether or not New Hampshire could ever convict the wrong person, and the case involving Elizabeth Knapp. And having listened to them talk about how, but for science, there might have been a different outcome, makes me appreciative of, even in a highly expert, well-trained criminal justice system that we have in the state, mistakes can get made.
There have been a lot of questions about economics in the death penalty. You won't be surprised to learn. At the risk of putting someone on the spot who doesn't know, we had an event here a couple of years ago, Chris Keating. We're lucky to have Chris Keating here today, and I remember you talked about the cost of the Addison case, and this was as of over a year ago at least. I know I'm putting you on the spot, and maybe you don't have that information, but maybe you could tell everyone who you are, and if you have a sense of how much has been spent on that case to this point, that would be, I think, really interesting information for people to know.
So I'm Chris Keating, the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Judicial Council. We oversee and fund the indigent defense delivery system, and previous existence, I was the Executive Director of the Public Defender Program during the defense of the Michael Addison case. And I think of cost in two forms. There's the three forms, really. There's the dollar cost, which to date is about $2.7 million that the state of New Hampshire has spent in the trial phase and in the appeal of that Addison case, and it continues. There's the opportunity cost, I think, as well. The lawyers who were defending Michael Addison weren't defending other people. wonder what they weren't working on,
FRM.
when they were so focused on seeking the conviction and death sentence for Michael Addison. Consumer protection comes to mind. And then the cost to the families of everyone who's involved. The Briggs family, the Addison family, the families of the lawyers who work on the cases that took a toll. So I see costs in the
With that
Absolutely.
with that information as background, is it worth the cost? Is it worth the cost? That's a policy matter, leaving constitutional issues and even moral issues aside.
I guess for me, yes, it is expensive. No doubt about it. It's the most expensive kind of case you're going to have. Luckily, they don't come along very often. I view it more as a marker, and I disagree with Andy. I think we have a civilized society, and that, frankly, there are some things that people do where it is so egregious that, and it would be like terrorism for the Tsarnaev situation, there are some ways for society to say to the world, this is a line that we think is so far exceeded that we're going to ask for the ultimate sanction. Timothy McVeigh killing 160 people in a federal building. I have zero problem with that type of person losing their life for what they did to those who were just going to work that day or going into a federal building to apply for some program. We can disagree on that. I just come down on the side that there are some markers that a society can say and set forth to the entire country and the world, these things we will not tolerate. We can't bring those 160 people back, but we can deprive you of your life for this extreme crime. And I guess that's one of those things about the death penalty that you can't ever square the circle. It's just not going to happen. Some will say, no, I think that's wrong. Others will say, I agree. I just come down on the side that there is that outer limit of conduct that society has the right to declare the ultimate price. Maybe someday, 100 years from now, we will have amended the Constitution and there will be no death penalty. But I just am saying, as of now, where I am, and the kind of world we're in with international terrorism, I'm frankly glad the federal government has the ability to hopefully level the playing field for some of the folks who would love to kill hundreds of Americans if they could, hundreds, and would gleefully do so. Many will kill themselves doing it first, so we won't have to worry about the debate tonight. But for those who don't, I think we need to exact that punishment.
Anyone else like to speak to the economics of the issue? And in particular, New Hampshire, I suppose, too, because...
You first?
Lou's on finance. You're at finance today, right?
We had finance today, and actually we heard from safety. The cost, when you look at the costs, obviously the costs are enormous. But when I look at the Briggs family, I say, it was worth it, or it's worth it. Some crimes are so egregious that I can't think of anything other than that person deserves the death penalty. That person deserves the death penalty. Because of the system, because of the mandatory appeals, you bear a cost. There's no question about that. And just had actually people from the AG's office, and I asked, how much money have we spent on a series of cases that are before us, and I'm looking to get that answer. But there is a cost. There's no question about that, and we don't have tremendous resources. That indeed is true also. But you got to. I think you have, in the case of you have to do what you think is the right thing. That's all.
You know, I never tell another person who's had someone murdered how they should feel about the death penalty, because I respect that position. But one of the things that bothers me about this discussion about the death penalty is that it holds up this event as some kind of a promise, that a panacea, that somehow you're going to get better if you just have this ritual killing. And what bothers me a lot about it is that, you know, that it's not, you don't get better from an event. It's the healing in the aftermath of murder, it's a process, it's not an event. And sometimes what bothers me a lot, I have this sense of solidarity, is when I see people who are so fixated on how their loved one died that they end up forgetting how they lived. And sometimes I can't help but think that we create this you know, this aspirational event for people that doesn't work. I mean, I was with people when Tim McVeigh was put to death. My friend Bud Welch's daughter Julie was one of the 167 people who was pulled out of there, and he was opposed to the death penalty. And as he says, you know, the problem is that it always happens too fast. You can't kill them enough times. They like to wake them up and kill them every day, but the problem is it doesn't do the one thing that you want. It doesn't bring anybody back. Now, if we could do that, I would be entirely in favor of it, but we can't exchange for that. And I think sometimes people, if you really care and are compassionate about people, you don't just hold up this false promise of them that it's going to be all better when once the killing's done.
I never claimed it would be all better.
Right.
I've never said, oh, it'll solve all the problems in the world. I just say, Renny, that Timothy McVeigh's of the world are that outer line where I think a death penalty is vastly justified, even if it can't be proven to have changed the course of human history. I think it shows society's respect for what should not have happened, which is those people should not have died. And individually, some of their families may say, I wish McVeigh hadn't been executed. I think more than not would say, yes, for this type of outrage against humanity, we as an organized society, following due process, are entitled to exact the ultimate punishment, that's all. Doesn't make the world a marvelous place now that he's gone, but it certainly, I hope, has some deterrent effect to some other person who might have a similar desire as he did. But I can't disprove it or prove it.
With an eye on the clock, I think we have time for one more question, and that's with apologies to those of you whose questions we don't have time to ask. Given, in particular, the botched executions that have taken place recently as a consequence of the unavailability of certain drug protocols, and given, you know, some states are talking about going back to other forms of execution other than lethal injection as a response to that. Would there be value in having executions be public, so that that we the people saw and fully appreciated the gravity of what is being done in our name when the ultimate sentence is carried out on a person?
Ouch. Well, they have been public in the past. They were public.
Right.
You know, they were public. We have gravitated away from that. This situation with the medical failures, I mean, that's not an acceptable situation. Obviously, if you if you go through the trial, you go through the process. I mean, it seems to me you ought to be capable of doing it and doing it properly. I don't, as a layman, I don't understand why the mix-ups. That's a terrible, terrible situation for all people, not only for the person, but what about the family that's witnessing this, and so it's that's a real problem. How do you deal with that? You know, I wish there were an easy answer. I don't have an easy answer. You know, we in New Hampshire it was hanging. That was the methodology. Then we went to the medical situation. Now you were thinking going back to where you have a choice. Would public executions be acceptable? You know, public is a very strange animal, and I mean, you got to gauge the public as to what they would do. Look at again. I'll just go back historically. I was researching, and I hate to bring this. I was researching Italian Americans, and in Louisiana, when they were 13 were gathered up for a killing, they were exonerated. But the public was so infuriated that they took them out and they hung all of them in the square. No one was ever accused of a crime. No one ever convicted of a crime. But the public's anxiety was addressed by doing that. You know, I'm not obviously advocating anything like that, but you know, the public's tough to figure on situations like this. You get a person like Carol Chessman who had a craving to kill. So he himself said, "Kill me so that I won't kill anybody else." That's a rather unbelievable situation. Remember, his execution was postponed so that Richard Nixon could go to Venezuela when he was vice president. I don't know how many of you remember that situation, but again, I recall it because of my class with Stuart Palmer. But this guy said, "If I don't get killed, I will kill." What do you do in that situation? You know, I think that's something that we have to think about. And think of the serial murders that we have, and we seem to be witnessing more and more of that. I don't know why, but if these people, you know, are going to continue to do that, what is the deterrent?
I'm deferential to Renny.
No, I mean, honestly, I don't have any, I just think that we can live without the death penalty in New Hampshire.
Well, it is 6:30, we're out of time. Thank you very much to everybody. Before concluding.